Hi, everyone. Welcome to season 3 of the Match+Book podcast. My name is Paul. I'm the adult services librarian here at East Brunswick Public Library. If you're joining us for the first time on Match+Book, we take user-submitted questions and we try to take those in different directions, try to cover different subjects, genres, topics, all related to literature, and give some recommendations and suggestions that might be tailored to something you like. And if it's not, then hopefully on the next episode, we'll cover something you like. And if you're joining us as a recurring listener, then thank you for your patronage. The first question I have here from a listener is, the last book I really enjoyed was Educated by Tara Westover. Can you recommend more like that? I think I mentioned briefly on season 1, I recommended the book The Glass Castle to the listeners. I think they're very similar. That was in a different context. I wasn't comparing Glass Castle to Educated, but I definitely think they're similar books. It's about adult women reflecting on their time as young girls in an isolated rural community, and both bring a brilliant adult perspective to the dysfunction they grew up with and sometimes the abuse that they endured, and have now made it through all of that to become well-functioning adults. Educated takes place in rural Idaho, Glass Castle in rural West Virginia mostly, but the family travels all over. Both are subject to abuse, but also retain a really great perspective on what created this situation, and they both try to be very even-handed and not blame their parents, but kind of understand how they ended up in that situation. And both also emphasize relationships with siblings as a way of giving them a taste of life outside of the compounds that they live on and experiencing the world around them, because they're both so isolated that they really don't know much about the greater world beyond whatever property that they live on. And this is kind of an outlet to getting them kickstarted on a way of joining the world at large. But more than anything, I would say my takeaway with both memoirs is the forthright tone they have about how they grew up. They're both trying to reckon with what happened to them in very mature ways, and I think that's what lends a lot of similarities to the memoirs. Another similar title would be The Liars Club by Mary Karr, and this is another very similar setup. It is a completely dysfunctional family living in a rural setting in the United States. And what I really think joins these two narratives is that they both go back in time and tell you how the authors felt about certain periods in their life, or some moments that really stuck out to them in the form of their parents' alcohol abuse, physical abuse, mental health issues, things like that, and how it affected them at the time, but also try to insert their current feelings on the matter as well. And so you get both perspectives, how they felt as a child and how they feel now. And I feel like that kind of grappling with the material from both perspectives is really intense, but also rewarding in showing how resilient they are and how they are able to kind of compartmentalize these things that happen to them. And to contrast the two narratives a little bit, what I like about Karr's narrative, that, I mean, it isn't to say Tara Westover's memoir isn't great, but Tara's is a little bit more straightforward in its prose, whereas Mary Karr, who is by trade a poet, gives a really poet's sense of word choice and sentence structure, and it really creates almost a different experience as a reader. So I would say definitely check both of them out if you're looking for something similar, but also something that feels different. And yet again, similar to Educated as well as The Glass Castle, there are these sibling relationships, because these are all big families we're dealing with, big dysfunctional families. So to see the inner workings of how the relationships work, who becomes the favorite of the parents, for what reasons, who's the outcast, and is it because they are bad kids, is it because they're acting out, or is it because they're trying to better themselves in ways their parents don't like? And it creates this really thorny relationship But in all three books, you could really experience these from all different perspectives and see it differently. But the dynamics are always quite similar. And now that we've discussed three books that are all quite similar and all are memoirs and nonfiction, I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit to a recommendation that is a fiction book. In that case, we have Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. And this is a story of 4 children who were abducted one night from their family's shanty boat. And they just wound up in what they learn is Tennessee Children's Home Society orphanage. 4 children just plucked from thin air, ended up in the situation that they had no idea how to deal with. And this is based on an actual real life scandal in which this orphanage was kidnapping children from their home and then selling them to families all across the southeastern United States. In it, we see these 4 children who grow up together and have this really great bond and then are split up to different families. And we follow them throughout their upbringings and then early adulthood, and then get a sense of what kind of families they were eventually put with and how that changes their upbringing and their many attempts to get back together. It's a wonderfully fictionalized take on a real life scandal while also taking an intensely personal route and showing how our upbringings, before this event and then after this event, and how each of those distinct upbringings really inform who they become throughout their lives and how both influence their personalities and their character over time. It's riveting, it's wrenching, it's uplifting all at the same time because you're looking at something that very well could have happened. These 4 children could have been real kids who were sent to this orphanage and grew up this way. Definitely check that one out if you're interested in a fictionalized take on something like Educated, but not exactly similar, but close enough where it definitely has a lot of the same themes going on. All right, moving on to our next question. A listener asks, what are some of your favorites to read around Halloween? Is there a scary book or story that you read annually this time of year? Personally, I'll pick an Edgar Allen Poe story to read each Halloween. Now, of course, you can't go wrong with Poe. There's so many greats to choose from that you really could keep going Halloween after Halloween with just another one of his stories. I don't personally read something like the same thing every Halloween, but I have a recent favorite that I read that I'm going to share with you, and then another one where I try to pick out stories from a short story book. So we'll start with the first one, and that is Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. It's somewhere between horror and mystery thriller, some paranormal activities thrown in there, and it feels like an updated version of The Haunting of Hill House. So if you've read that or watched the Netflix show, you'd definitely be interested in this book. So the basic premise is that a father moves to a dilapidated old Victorian estate in the woods with his daughter, and he experiences a lot of malevolent spirits, like phenomenon, things like that. And a lot of it happens to his daughter. She is facing the brunt of it for reasons you will find out that become clear as the book goes on. So he writes a book about what his experiences in this estate, and the book, this is a fictionalized book within the book. So this fictionalized book becomes a bestseller. And when the girl grows older, her father's passed away, but she wants to return to the estate to figure out what exactly happened to me, because she doesn't remember any of it, but so much has been written about her and she's like a famous subject of what has happened. She's trying to unearth all of the bizarre paranormal events that took place when she was a child. And just to compare it to something else that you might know, it feels like the Overlook Hotel from The Shining, where it's so eerie, strange, so many bizarre events taking place. And the book kind of sets you up as like, is this the work of some paranormal spirit? And, you really don't know when it's going on. Like it could be anything. And we're right there with the girl who's the subject of the book, who's now an adult. We're right there with her, experiencing all of these things in real time as they're happening to her, as she's staying in this estate and trying to fix it up. It just creates this extra level of terror throughout the book. And I like, there's twists, there's turns, because it's a mystery as well, but also a horror novel. It's really packages both in a way where it balances the two genres out in a really great way. Riley Sager, the author, has a number of these books that work in multiple similar genres such as these. So if you do end up enjoying this book or have read other books by him, I would recommend, there's several others that scratch the same itch that this one does. So check those out as well. So another one I like to read around this time of year is The October Country by Ray Bradbury. This is one where I like to pick and choose a few different stories every year and just kind of sift through them, read and reread them, because they're written with the whole month of October in mind. Bradbury himself described the overarching theme of the book and the short stories within as, quote, that country whose people are autumn people, thinking only autumn thoughts, whose people passing at night on the empty sidewalks sounds like rain, end quote. And so I love that as just his jumping off point for all of these strange fantasy, science fiction, kind of dark occult stories. Ones with that spark of ingenuity are reminiscent of his masterwork, Fahrenheit 451. But I don't want to touch on every story. I think there's 19 stories in here, but I do want to give you a glimpse of what you're in for if you do happen to read this. So one story is called Skeleton, and it's about a man who thinks his skeleton is moving and operating independently of his own movements, and that skeleton has a mind of its own. And while this could come off as really corny and bad, it takes somebody like Ray Bradbury to kind of ground it in reality in ways you probably wouldn't expect. Another one of my favorites is The Jar. And I know I'm going to be dating myself here, but this is a really great episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show that was from the 80s. And it's about a man who just finds a jar of some amorphous object, and he invites people to look at it. And everybody has their own interpretation of what is in the jar, because it's such a strange, is it a liquid? Is it a solid? Is it a little creature in there? Like, nobody knows. It drives people mad, and it creates a whole frenzy around the situation in ways where it's like, people, it's just a jar. I don't know what's happening here, but it kind of makes you step back and take a look at mass hysteria with a little sci-fi twist on it. Those are two that give you a real feel of what the short story collection is like. Definitely check that one out. If you read Fahrenheit 451, or if you just kind of like strange science fiction, kind of occult stories. So that's going to do it for the first episode of season 3 of Match+Book. You can listen to the Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast, or one of our other wonderful series at www.ebpl.org/podcast. Thanks again for listening. And thank you to Moshe Hosek for editing this episode.